LaHood.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing today, and I'm grateful for the witnesses and their valuable testimony today on the opportunities for strengthening the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. It's important. As some of my colleagues have discussed, we need to continue looking at ways to ensure opportunities for robust trade and economic engagement, including permanent and reciprocal trade agreements around the world, particularly on the African continent. While we have had some positive steps, including a framework for the Kenyan FTA and continued engagement on AGOA, I hope we can work together to encourage the Biden administration to end the trade moratorium and engage at a high level with countries on the African continent. Our global competitors, including China, are working to manipulate the U.S.'s reputation and perception on the global stage, including on the African continent, and using every opportunity and investment to their advantage. As China is now the largest single country trading partner in sub-Saharan Africa, I am concerned that continued Chinese investment in trade, infrastructure, and energy will put the U.S. at a strategic disadvantage. My question is for Ambassador Mahoney. What do you think the role of the private sector or public-private partnerships is in to help the U.S. better compete and invest in countries, including the African continent?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think the role of the private sector in this equation is absolutely key. And again, if you go back to this, this concept of comparative advantage, the U.S. private sector, I think, is a real asset for the U.S. in trying to deepen ties with these countries, both economic and political. There is a lot of Chinese investment in Africa, but if as I'm sure you and others who have been there and have thought about these issues know, there's also a lot of demand for American investment. One of the things that American companies bring when they invest in places like Africa is a desire to use the local workforce, to train the local workforce in ways that empower people and create opportunities. American companies also bring American values. I mean, the American companies are governed by our laws, by the FCPA. One of the things that Microsoft is proud to have done recently is to join with other cloud companies on something called the Trusted Cloud Principles, where we have come together and said that we're not going to compete in a race to the bottom when people want to use our technology in ways that would reinforce authoritarianism and undermine democratic values. So I think that that's very key. And, when you go back to, PEPFAR is another, as we've talked about, as a successful program, public-private partnerships were an important part of that.
Thank you. And then, Ambassador Mahoney, in terms of your prior work on U.S.-Kenyan negotiations, how can the U.S. be a leader in setting digital trade standards with obviously Kenya and other African nation, and what types of standards would you say are most important to include in the ongoing U.S.-Kenya talks and future U.S.-Africa talks?
Well, Microsoft was a big supporter of USMCA, which, as you know, Congressman, you were very involved in, contains a very high standard digital trade chapter and disciplines on data localization and data flows. I think, though, that it's important that we combine those kinds of demands that the United States would have with also a sort of a more positive and affirmative vision for technology. And, that takes me back to the need that Africans have for connectivity. I think ultimately, the U.S. being involved in investments in connectivity in Africa is something that would benefit those countries. It would also benefit the United States because it would ensure that we are part of that technology ecosystem, and also ensure that Africa's technology ecosystem is built in a way that is consistent with American values and support for democratic institutions.
Well, I agree with you in looking at what we negotiated in USMCA as kind of the standard we ought to look to in future trade agreements. Do you sense there'll be any resistance to what we put in there that currently applies to Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think a lot of countries have, just around the world, not just in Africa, but there are, a number of countries have concerns about where data is stored, particularly sensitive data. And even in the digital trade chapter that we have in USMCA and in the U.S.-Japan agreement, there are exceptions that allow countries to require localization of certain sensitive data. But I think it's also important that the United States make the case for why overly restrictive policies can really restrict. It can limit the ability for individuals and businesses in different countries, particularly in small markets, to have access to the best technology, the best data storage capabilities, the best cybersecurity protections. So I think it's important that we make that case. In addition to recognizing that there are some sensitive areas where we understand that localization of data might make sense for countries and provide some allowance for that.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Congressman Byer?